trust him. Oh, when it seems like it's not going to work out on your behalf, you need to learn how to trust God anyhow. Somebody reminds me that when you trust God, he has a way of working things out. Men, when we walk with God, there's some evidence that we've been walking with the Lord. Because when you walk with God, you're not fretted by everything that comes your way. When you walk with God, you're not upset by everything everybody has to say. When you walk with God, you're not torn out of the frame by every wind that blows. You're not upset with everybody by the way they look at you. You're not tore up every time somebody frowns at you. You're not tore out of the frame when somebody doesn't call your name. When you're walking with God, the only thing you need to know is that the same God that started me out a long time ago, he's the same God that can make a way out of no way. I wish I had somebody praying with me. He's brought me from a mighty long way. When I walk with God, it provides evidence that God's been with me and I've been with the Lord. I don't walk the way I used to walk. I don't talk the way I used to talk. When I've been with the Lord, there's a difference in my life. And I'm so glad that when I walk with the Lord, he'll give me everything that I need. I wish I had somebody praying with me. We need to learn how to trust God. But there are several examples of what happens when men walk with God. For my Bible tells me that Noah walked with God. And when Noah walked with God, yes, Noah had some issues. He had a drinking problem. But when he walked with God, God allowed him to be a transformative agent from one world to the next. There's something about when you walk with God that people don't have a heaven and hell to put you in. Because when you walk with God, you know without a doubt that the Lord will make a way out of no way. Well, that's not all. My Bible tells me that Enoch walked with God. And by virtue of walking with God, we are reminded that Enoch was translated. In other words, he did not taste death. God came down and got him, picked him up from where he was, and took him on to glory. You see, when you walk with God, God can do great things in your life, but that's not all. I am reminded of how David walked with God when he said, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and I will fear no evil. You see, when you walk with God, evil can't bother you. Trouble can't bother you. When you walk with God, everything will be all right. It may be hard sometimes. It may get rough sometimes. But by virtue of walking with God, everything will be all right. David's not the only one that walked with God, but Stephen walked with God. You ask me how I know that he walked with God? When they stoned him to death, some of those that were trying to kill him looked upon his face and said his face shone the glory of God. When you're walking with God, when people are trying to tear you down, it doesn't matter. When you walk with God and folk don't understand, it doesn't matter. When you walk with God and people talk about you and scandalize your name, it doesn't matter. When you walk with God and people talk about you, call you everything but a child of God, you can reach down and say, my God will make a way out of no way. There's something about walking with God. Paul walked with God. I said Paul walked with God. That's why he was able, when he had prayed and asked God to remove the thorn from his flesh, and God said, my grace is sufficient. I don't care what you're going through. When you walk with God, everything will be all right. Somebody knows what I'm talking about. He's brought us from a mighty long way. When men walk with God, other people ought to be able to see the Lord in you. When you walk with God, it doesn't mean that everything's going to go your way all the time. But by virtue of walking with God, you'll have the ability to stand the test of time. Somebody in here knows what I'm talking about. But when I look back over my life and I see what the Lord has done for me, it reminds me of how good God has been. It reminds me of where God has brought me from. It reminds me of what God has done for me. It reminds me that God is all powerful, that he's all knowing, that he's all caring, that he's everywhere, and he's everywhere all the time. I am reminded that God is a way maker. I am reminded that God is a burden bearer. I am reminded that he's a way maker. I am reminded that he's a way out of no way. I am reminded that he's a bridge over troubled water. Somebody knows what I'm talking about. God will make a way out of no way. And I'm glad. I said I'm glad. I'm glad for what he's done for me. When men walk with God, there's some evidence that you've been with the Lord. You said, well, Pastor, how can I continue to walk with all of the stuff that's going on? But you got to walk anyhow. You see, I'd rather walk with the Lord than to walk with the devil. I'd rather walk with the Lord than to bow down to men. I'd rather walk with the Lord than to be anything that other folk want me to be other than what God has for me to be. I'd rather walk with the Lord because I know that the Lord will sustain me. As men of God, you've got to learn how to walk with him. You know, we've been walking with everybody else and everything else. You better check who your partner is. You have to be careful who you walk with. Abraham was the example that when you walk with him, you don't have to worry about it. God had that thing in his plan, already in his hand, and he knew what he was going to do. But it was a mere test for Abraham. Could he give up the thing that was dearest to him? And I say to you today that there's nothing in your life and my life that's all that important that we should not be able to lay it down before the Lord. You can try to hang on to that lifestyle, but you're going to get old and wrinkled one day. And them same folks telling you how good you look are going to be laughing at you when you pushing that wheelbarrow or you pulling that wagon. You got to realize in life that we are not immortal. There should be nothing that we can't give to the Lord. But in order for that to happen, you have to walk with him. Fathers, you need to walk with him. No problem too great that God cannot fix it. If you want change in your family, walk with the Lord. If you want your household to be saved, walk with the Lord. If you want your children to come, then walk with the Lord. If you want to stop doing some of those things that you've been trying to let go of, just walk with the Lord. The preacher won't have to tell you it's wrong. By virtue of walking with the Lord, the Spirit will speak to you and tell you you need to let it go. Let it go. You know, some folk, it's almost as if they're waiting for somebody to tell them it's wrong. But when you walk with the Lord, you know it's wrong.